You know, this channel has always been this, I guess, grand exercise in gushing about my favorite video games, but of course in a Let's Play format. I'm not really out here to be an entertainer so much as, I guess, an advocate for all this media that I just like a heck of a lot. I consider encouraging even one person to play the games I cover in a video more of a win than any number of views that same video might get. But sometimes you just gotta get down to brass tacks, and rather than do another months-long Let's Play, just spend some time telling someone this is the thing you like, why you like it, and hopefully they'll like it to at least some degree too. I consider that desire the essence of what makes YouTube as a whole worthwhile. I know everything nowadays has to be a hustle or a multi-step program to becoming rich or successful, but to me, the purest and most enriching aspect of YouTube, and well, actually the internet as a whole, is the ability to just share your interests with people, to be able to talk about a thing in earnest and convey some excitement about it. That's really all this channel ever has been for me. This channel that's been going on for almost, 14 years. And in the spirit of such intent, today, I'm just going to gush about all of my favorite games, but a little bit differently than I did things the first time around. A little over 10 years ago, I made these two videos, and that was coming from the mind of 2014 me. The me that had only just seen the release of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. The me that didn't even know the Wii U was such a failure yet. Had never really delved into modern PC gaming, nor knew what the hell a Switch or even an NX was supposed to be. Point being, that was a long time ago, and a lot has changed since. I also think that someday I'll probably make this list one more time, probably when this entire exercise comes to an end and I'm ready to close the channel down, but that won't be for a very long time. So I guess consider this sort of a milestone video, 10 years of reflection, but looking ahead to the future, a midterm paper, I guess, but hopefully way more fun. This is not supposed to be some grand statement. I do not consider myself some pretentious critic whose word is law, and that my number one game should be everyone else's number one game, and everyone who disagrees is an idiot who needs to reevaluate their choices. I just want to offer my own perspective, and to rave for a while, of course, but a couple of things before we get started. Firstly, I'm going to try to avoid putting multiple numbered or explicitly stated sequels in this top 20 and just sort of grandfather the series into that entry with my favorite game in the series. For example, let's say hypothetically, if Mass Effect 2 were on here, then 1 and 3 would get included in that same spot with 2 as kind of the representative pick, since in this hypothetical scenario, it would be my favorite in the series. And secondly, this whole thing is meant to be laid back. Chill. Nothing here is authoritative or objectively correct. This is entirely, unequivocally subjective, but I do ask that anyone watching please be mindful and respectful of that intent. If I say I like the sequel to a game more than the first one and you disagree, maybe don't go ballistic in the comments. Just hear me out. Thank you. Alright, originally this entire video was going to be in 4 parts, but since you guys voted for it to be one big video, we should probably get a move on. This is one of the longest scripts I've ever written for this channel, so without further ado, let's begin. I'll never forget the first time I saw that train pull into the station and my weird little horned character stepped out into his new home for the first time way back in 2002. I know a lot of millennial-age gamers remember their first experiences with the big generational leaps in graphics between consoles back during the 2000s, where PlayStation 1 became the PlayStation 2 and Nintendo 64 became GameCube. It's ironic then that my first real experience with what the GameCube had to offer was technically just an upscaled Nintendo 64 game, but even still, this is where that awe and wonder kind of started for me. Animal Crossing's allure was incredibly simple in that it truly did feel like the first game that let you do, and I say this with massive air quotes, anything. Of course, this was years before open world games and sandbox games were even a concept. The closest we'd had at all to such an idea up to this point was Grand Theft Auto 3, but it's 2002, I was 9 years old and that game wasn't even on my radar yet. Animal Crossing just seemed so limitless. Get a job, pay your mortgage, collect all of the things, relax, go fishing, even play some old Nintendo games in your house when you wanted to kick back. It was this weird combination of brain-tickling busy work coupled with progression that was so novel at the time. I just never seen anything like it before. On top of the cozy vibes, the incredibly charming characters, art direction, and the music, there was just something to all of this that I knew I'd be coming back to play for a very long time. Of course, seeing the series move to a handheld was exciting, and then seeing it get even bigger and better on the Wii was even more so. But the one that I think we can all agree has truly launched Animal Crossing into the spotlight was the 2020 release, Animal Crossing New Horizons. I still go back and forth on whether or not this is my favorite in the series at times, because it has some glaring issues, and has stripped back the series' charm in certain areas that I do think make the game hard to come back to at times, but I can't ignore the serious improvements and the emphasis on progression that New Horizons adds to the series that was in no way even close to as well fleshed out before. Maybe New Leaf had a smidgen of it, but New Horizons is far and away the most advanced version of what Animal Crossing has always been. Just a cozy, relaxing, and thoroughly personal experience that is entirely what you make of it. It's just a vibes thing, man. It really is. And yet I can't even say for sure if New Horizons will still be the Animal Crossing game I like the most 5 or even 10 years from now. It could be whatever the next one is. Maybe I'll find myself preferring the original, or New Leaf, or even City Folk again. All I know is that they're all kind of reflective of the same sort of ideal experience that really no other series seems capable of replicating. While genre definitions are important, this series occupies the life sim space in a way unlike anything else. It's not as strategic as The Sims, it's not filled with as much RPG progression as your average farming simulator, it's just Animal Crossing. It's entirely its own thing, and I hope that never changes for as long as it exists. Sometimes I just want to turn the game on, talk to some NPCs, build a couple things, shake some trees, catch some fish, and vibe with the music, you know? And that's something that truly only a video game is capable of doing. Oh look, it's the most over-discussed, obsessed-over video game of the last 15 years. Seriously, I know nobody can shut up about The Last of Us, and every single time it gets brought up, whether it's the sequel or the TV show or even just the idea of Naughty Dog as a developer, somebody out there has to go on a 20-minute rant about how The Last of Us is still the greatest video game ever made and this perfect, ideal experience that all AAA games should measure up to, and no. You're not getting any of that here. I was actually hesitant to put this game on the list at all because I don't know what I can say about The Last of Us that's already been said, and there's other games that I could possibly justify putting over it, but I don't know. Maybe my perspective is slightly different than what you're used to. Something I've maintained since the very beginning, all the way back in 2013, is that The Last of Us was always lightning in a bottle, that it should never be replicated because in my personal opinion, this style of game is not what video games should strive to be. Calling it an interactive movie or TV show is really not that far off, and I know especially back when it came out that a lot of people thought video games would trend in this direction design-wise. I still shudder at the thought because that isn't what video games should be, I think. That doesn't mean video games can't be focused on presentation and story above all else, but I don't think they should follow the format of what The Last of Us does, or for that matter, even what Uncharted did before it, because let's be honest, that's all The Last of Us was. A much more serious, grounded take on the style of game that Uncharted used to be. It has been Naughty Dog's bread and butter for almost 20 years now. A story like The Last of Us is just as well left up to books and movies. I know this plot in particular is often compared to Cormac McCarthy's The Road, a fantastic book and a solid movie, but that's not to say The Last of Us doesn't offer a ton of unique perspectives, and the acting and the framing and presentation here are all incredible. But all this stuff worked because this game was the first and only one to do it right. Everything that came afterward felt like a cheap imitation or a desperate attempt to mimic its success. Even the sequel, which I don't hate like a certain subset of people do, but I also don't find it particularly great either, and it just can't capture any of the impact that the first game had, because that game has a good story because of how it starts, how it moves, and because of how it ends. I'll be the first to say that I was never okay with a sequel to this game even when it was announced, at least if they were intent on reusing the same cast. I think I would have been more okay with a different cast in the same universe, as the world building in The Last of Us was great and would have been fine to expound upon, but these characters, Ellie and Joel, in this story are what makes this whole thing work. But can I also add that I actually really like the gameplay? It's very unique in its kind of deliberate attempt to be hard to handle and a struggle to play through. It's definitely a third-person shooter experience I can't get anywhere else, and I appreciate it for its uniqueness. The dichotomy between human enemies and infected is always a fun rock, paper, scissors experience, and even when you get good with the game's rigid and weighty aiming mechanics, all the little nuances and added aspects of strategy and environmental obstacles always makes this game a treat to play. I find it satisfying and engaging in its own way. Would I want this gameplay in literally any other game, though? No. Absolutely not. Like I've been trying to say, everything about The Last of Us works because of the complete package that it is. The slow, plodding traversal, the mix of stealth, combat, and exploration, the sometimes really garbage weapons, and clunkiness of things like the melee combat and the crafting system, the scripted sequences, the stoppages for cutscenes and optional dialogue. All this works because of the experience The Last of Us was specifically crafted to be, the story it's trying to tell. In almost any other context, so much of this is a terrible idea or impossible to execute in a good satisfying manner. This game is truly special, and I don't ever want to see another developer take a crack at it again, least of all Naughty Dog. I would much rather they continue to make games, honestly, more like the next one on this list. That's right, 2 Naughty Dog games back to back, and I would be lying if I said I didn't vastly prefer this series to really anything else this company has done before or since, but I'm also not about to say this series is perfect neither, nor am I clamoring for more of it, because with essentially 6 games, and not to mention certain other series filling the same niche like Tomb Raider, whether we're talking the original games or the Survivor trilogy, it doesn't really matter to me. Unlike The Last of Us, this is a genre that is truly well exhausted, and while I'll happily take more, I'm not saying I necessarily need it. I just really like when my video games have a fun personality. I like camp. I like swashbuckling adventures. Uncharted is all of that in the most traditional AAA format you can possibly imagine, and in a lot of ways, that makes this series kind of frustrating. So many times it is so close to greatness, but falls just short. The first game had a lot of good ideas, but sort of just failed to really explore broader horizons gameplay-wise. The third game had almost too much going on, to the point where at times it seemed to just drag on and on in certain sections with no real reason to do so. And the fourth game, apart from making one of the most likable protagonists in video game history a monumental dickhead, sort of just couldn't find a consistent footing between chapters in service of the Last of Us-esque style of storytelling that, again, I just don't think works as well in other games. Then there's Golden Abyss and Lost Legacy, games that I do love dearly, but much shorter experiences that obviously had different goals in mind outside of the main quadrilogy. That leaves us with Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, and this is the perfect Uncharted experience. This game is just non-stop fun from start to finish. There are so many set pieces, so many cool settings, and there is so much ostentatious and overdramatic goodness here that I am in love for just about every moment in motion. I think the only chapters of this game I don't absolutely love are like the first couple of chapters in Nepal, where you're just sort of exploring a dilapidated city and getting into pretty standard boring gunfights. But even that has an excellent chase later on with a helicopter and a really cool puzzle in the middle involving a giant statue. And once you meet an old character from the first game a little later on, it just picks up from there and literally never comes down until the credits roll. There is so much energy and action in this game that it feels like a shot in the arm every time I pick it up. I just adore its sense of scope and scale. As far as filmic video games are concerned, given that the industry had an obsession with them from like 2008 to 2015, I think this is the best of what the entire game industry was able to offer in that regard. A couple of others got close, but Uncharted 2 is my absolute favorite of its kind, and I don't think it'll ever be topped. Okay, I know a lot of people, including myself, have a real soft spot for the Nintendo GameCube and its many hits. By all rights, this console was practically a failure, and I can understand why Nintendo isn't as keen to look back on it as some of its greater successes like the Nintendo Wii and the Super Nintendo. But the GameCube was and is a very special console. That entire generation was special, and even though it was thoroughly dominated by the PlayStation 2, I love looking back on the sorts of games that were coming out at the time. The generation before was like the entire industry learning how to use 3D, while this generation was, okay, we know how to use it, now what do we do with it? And instead of simple, natural progressions in gameplay, everyone just decided to get real weird with it. For my money, the most underrated thing about the GameCube was whatever was going on with all the various game engines on this thing. The physics and the controls were just sort of all over the place. Nothing was super precise yet, so instead it was all kind of fast and loose. Your Pikmin cursor wobbling all over the place, Mario Kart Double Dash being built around its drift system lest you experience ice physics on every track. GameCube games just have this feel to them, you know? But what makes them so cool is that people have figured out how to maximize whatever the hell is going on here and execute pure gameplay bliss out of each and every one of these excellent games and take them to unimaginable heights. For me, that's what makes Super Mario Sunshine my favorite game in the entire Mario series, and I mean that sincerely. Look, this game is weird. It is janky. The voice acting, when it happens, is so bad that it wraps around to being good again.
Mama Peach, I'm your mama?
It's got some absolutely garbage level design, and in a couple of stages, it straight up doesn't work the way it should. Hello, pachinko machine. But two things. First, I love the vibes of this game. The tropical setting, the literal sunshine everywhere, the fact that I don't have to physically be there because, spoiler alert, I absolutely hate the heat and high humidity on top of it. I just like looking at it and being a part of it and roaming around these worlds. But so much of that love is because of the movement here. Controlling Mario in this game is just the best. I love the loosey-goosey nature of the controls, the precise but floaty way he moves, the insane jump combos one can pull off, and the crazy ways one can incorporate the jetpack FLUDD into all of that. This is the one 3D Mario game I play over and over again just because of how good it feels, to the point where even the worst stages have grown on me, where every world offers something unique, where going for 100%, pointless as it may be, is thrilling for the challenge alone, but less so because of the difficulty and more so because of the methodology. I just like finding new and exciting ways to complete a mission. How high can I jump? Can I do it floodless? Can I hit all these spots I shouldn't be able to reach first? It's just a game feel thing, man. Nothing about this game works just by looking at it. You gotta rotate that control stick under your thumb for yourself. Time those A button presses as Mario spins through the air, and spin to win to understand what I mean, and you gotta get good at it. I'm not saying I'm super great at this game, but I do understand almost entirely what its movement system is capable of. I understand how to string things together and to pull off some of the more advanced tech. It's a platformer, sure, but satisfying in a way that a fighting game can be, which is incredibly rare for this genre. I actually don't really love platformers all that much on their own, but if it feels good to play, that's where I'm hooked. And Super Mario Sunshine is, to me, kind of the poster child of that desire, at least as far as 3D platformers go. That love for a specific style of gameplay I didn't know I needed, but has since been serviced by plenty of other games since, including a few that are yet to come on this list. For now, though, I'll just leave you with this. No matter the jank, no matter how weird, no matter how frustrating you might find it, I will always love Super Mario Sunshine in its own special and very weird way. As I've grown older, I've tried to give myself the opportunity to both have rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia and continue to love things that I grew up with, while at the same time allowing myself to understand how something may be perceived as old, ancient, or outdated in some way. So when I look back on the Nintendo 64 games I grew up with, it's really hard for me to justify to others a lot of what I loved about the games on that console. That said, there are 3 Nintendo 64 games on this list, but I digress. Fact of the matter is, early 3D games just kinda didn't age well, and that's just how time works. So much of what was being developed at the time was clunky. Revolutionary, yes, but going back to it in the modern day is like wading through a thick, swampy mess of stiff controls, awkward camera angles, and textures so low res that you genuinely can't make out what something is supposed to be sometimes. If there were ever a Nintendo 64 game, however, that aged like the finest of sherries from Andalusia, Spain, it's gotta be Star Fox 64. To this day, the peak of rail shooters and the Star Fox series as a whole. In essence, it was basically just a remake of the original on the Super Nintendo, but my god, did it ever and does it ever work so incredibly well. It's fast-paced, high-octane, active as all hell, and has buttery, silky smooth controls. The transition from on-rails to all-range combat is completely and utterly seamless. I've never before or since piloted an air or spacecraft in a video game that's felt better than the R-Wing, and in particular, this iteration of the R-Wing. Of course, it looks old, but given the fact that you're spending all this time moving past everything and the game's ability to make important objective markers incredibly obvious and transparent, the simplicity is actually a good thing. Every single time I turn this game on, I'm impressed by how good it feels to play, how nice it is to look at, and just how fun it is. So much so that I've easily beaten the various pathways hundreds of times in my life. Even the 3DS remake, while still very good, almost feels unnecessary due to how well the 64 version has stood the test of time. But that remake is there if you like a bit of an update or a shot at gyro controls, although I think the game controls perfectly fine with a control stick. This is all to say, though, that the Star Fox series has had a couple of other bangers as well. On top of the remake, I generally like Star Fox Assault more than most people, and rank it pretty closely to the 64 game, although it does fall short in a couple of ways, but it's still a very good game. It's just funny to me that this series has received 4 installments since, and none of them can top what is essentially just a better looking remake of the very first game. It's just everything one could want a video game like this to be, perfectly cooked to medium rare and left to be exactly what it is, without trend-chasing design shifts, a shift in focus towards the things the developers may have wanted more of the first time around, weird RPG mechanics, or the use of terrible platform-specific control gimmicks. It's just a damn good game, still, and it always will be. Okay, so I promise I'm not breaking my rule here of numbered sequels and whatnot, because while yes, technically this is at least theorized to be a direct sequel to another game on this list, there's no explicit confirmation, no number to speak of, and nothing stated as such by the developers of said game. To all but the most hardcore of fans, this is technically just a standalone game, and I'm going to treat it as such, especially when there really is nothing in the world like it. If there ever was a game that I felt the world at large delivered a cruel injustice towards upon its release, it has to be The Last Guardian, Guardian, and I can think of a number of reasons why, but I definitely do disagree with said reasons. A big part of it was the length of time between releases. The Last Guardian was up there with Duke Nukem Forever and Final Fantasy XV for what was, at the time, some of the worst development hell in video game history. Back when game dev cycles were like 3 to 4 years at most, these games took nearly or even more than a decade to release. In The Last Guardian's case in particular, much of that was due to the fact that when it was announced, it was meant to be a PlayStation 3 game, and while the PlayStation 4 wasn't even on anyone's radar, what Team Ico intended for the game to be able to accomplish just wasn't working with the current console. It was mostly developed, but had to be entirely redeveloped and ported over to the next console once the PlayStation 4 was announced, as it was determined that simply pushing to get the game done on the inferior PlayStation 3 did not outweigh the benefits of waiting a few more years and taking advantage of the newer, better hardware. Once it finally did come out, expectations were sky high. This was, after all, the sequel to one of the most important video games in the history of the medium, and a lot of people just kind of found it frustrating, unintuitive, janky, and wholly difficult to play. To be sure, I'm not about to tell you that The Last Guardian has amazing controls or an equally amazing camera. Hell, if it did, I would have been utterly surprised. But I think people fail to remember that, well, there's never been a Team Ico game that did these things right. In Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, however, it was at least simple. You hold a girl's hand and you swing a stick, or you climb on things and stab a sword. Super basic and very easy to understand, despite my paraphrasing. In The Last Guardian, almost everything is a mere suggestion. A gesture. You're controlling a character, yes, but that character is mainly influencing Trico, the big rat bird dog. It's like an extension of yourself, but also an explicit lack of some measure of control, as you're kind of at the mercy of its AI, right? Well, yes and no. I think most people just fundamentally did not understand The Last Guardian's gameplay. I think people saw this as like summons mechanics or escort gameplay. You know, where it's all point at the thing and make your summon do the thing, but also lead your summon to where it's supposed to go, and kinda, but no, not really. That's never what The Last Guardian was. It's almost like the patience and fortitude to work with the artificial intelligence that is Trico is actually baked into the game's mechanics. And that seems like it would be a test of patience, but as soon as you do this, and I promise this was for me the revelatory moment that busted this entire game wide open for me the first time I played it, The Last Guardian then transforms into one of the most incredible experiences in video game history. I'm not saying Trico's AI is perfect, but it is very predictably, unpredictably predictable. Everything about its actions makes sense. Everything is consistent. Everything it wants to do, and you can tell it to do, is equal parts intuitive and incredible. It isn't elegant, but learning to work with it is what makes this game special. I can tell you that the moment I figured this out, which was about 1/4 of the way into the game, I never had another problem again engaging with the game's systems. I never got stuck on anything but the mechanics of the puzzles themselves. I never felt the need to look anything up or ask for help. I just went on this journey with this strange looking creature that ended up being one of the most endearing, sweet, and mesmerizing characters I've ever engaged with in a video game. Everything The Last Guardian intends to be, it executes with perfection. I've played through this game multiple times since, and I'm left in awe each and every time, and for my money, this game's ending is actually the best of all of the games in the Team Ico trilogy. It just break down, man. Every time that ending comes up, I lose it. It's such a special experience that I think so many people wrote off so eagerly and so quickly. It does not make as strong a first impression, I'll give you that. It's not as easy a game to engage with and understand as so many others like it, but I have never in all my life felt a video game was so worthwhile to understand. It was so rewarding to become acquainted with and was so memorable and impactful that it's stuck with me ever since. Just festering in the back of my mind as this deeply personal, incredibly special moment that I'll honestly never get back because it really only worked so well the first time, of course. I will also add the scorching hot take that I actually think this soundtrack is the best of the trilogy as well. Shocking, I know, but man, is it something special. The Last Guardian is, in my opinion, a totally underrated and underappreciated masterpiece and is every bit as good as the legacy of its predecessors. It's just a shame that it never got its due, so I'm giving it here. From one contemplative game to another. Here's a really short one, so hopefully I don't spend too long talking about it. I know on the last top 20 list I made all those years ago, this was in my top 5. I definitely do not have the same fondness for Journey now as I did back then, but man, I'd only be lying to myself if I said that impact wasn't long-lasting in some way. To this day, I've yet to play a game like Journey, and there are a lot that did anything as well as Journey. It's not some grand gameplay experience, it isn't there to test your limits or challenge you in any meaningful way, it's exactly what the game says it is, a journey. the most walking of any walking simulator to ever simulate, and yet it does this so much better than all the rest. To start, I've still never seen a video game with art direction like this that in any way surpasses it. Even Journey's many direct or spiritual successors like Sky or Abzu or The Pathless, while great in their own ways, are just a bit too blocky or more complex in a way where their imperfections stand out. Journey as a game is like something I think artists really ought to study more in how to make something that's semi-minimalist, simple in presentation, and honestly doesn't use very high-resolution textures into something so gorgeous. I mean, the balance between what was put into this game's visuals versus how good it actually looks to this day might be the most lucrative payoff in video game history. It's just incredible how good everything looks and sounds here even 12 years later. I'm thoroughly stunned by it even now, and have yet to see a game that tops it. Still, that's such a testament to the work that was done here, and I know I'm dwelling on the visuals a lot, but this is one of the only games I've ever played where that's such an important part of what makes it work, that I kind of have to dwell on it so much. Equally as impactful, of course, is the brilliant soundtrack by Austin Wintory. To this day, tracks like Nations, Road of Trials, Apotheosis, and Temptations get regular rotation in my day-to-day music, a rotation that really isn't filled with all that much video game music, mind. It's so successfully emotionally manipulative, but not in a bad way. Art is meant to be emotionally manipulative, and the soundtrack can stick those pins in your chest and make your stomach drop entirely on its own, but when paired with the game's visuals, it's something truly magical. I don't quite classify Journey as one of those lightning in a bottle games as I do The Last of Us, but I do think the attempts to replicate it have been almost just as unsuccessful. I think of games like Rime and Gris and Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, and they have been bold attempts, although they definitely use their visuals in different ways, and I don't exactly think those are necessarily worse games, but they just don't hit quite the same for me. Even the aforementioned Abzu is a great time, but it also feels like it's trying to be Journey in the water. And you know, maybe if I'd played that game first, I'd feel the opposite of the way I do now. I love the environments of Abzu. I definitely prefer the aesthetic of the sea to that of the desert, but there's just something about Journey in particular that's so untouchable, so uniquely its own. Maybe it is that soundtrack. Maybe it's the way you move around in the sand and how it flows like it's water as you glide across it. That golden glow of the sun, or the valleys of emotions to go along with the peaks in places where danger is afoot. That minimalist interaction in the multiplayer with others that you meet on your quest, and your little movement abilities and all the quirks that come with that. The personalities of the little ribbon creatures and the way each section is able to totally change the mood of the entire journey. It's a top 20 game for me, obviously, but probably in my top 10 for games that I recommend everyone play at least once in their lives. It is so entirely distinctively video gamey in a way that no other medium can ever hope to be, and for that, it will always be one of my favorites. Okay, let's talk about a game that, while I know I'm nowhere near the only person that likes it, it's so uniquely me. I do like racing games, and sports games quite a lot, which I know a whole lot of traditional gamers and other Let's Players just roll their eyes at and like to pretend they don't exist, and that's totally fair. I get it. But I grew up with all of them. Madden, NFL Quarterback Club, All-Star Baseball, MLB 2K, NASCAR Racing, Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, NBA Live, and all the EA Sports big games from the SSX Trickies to the NFL Streets of the world. Does anyone remember NBA Ballers too? I played the hell out of that. Anyway, the early and mid-2000s was a golden age for games like this, for anyone that remembers at least. Some of the greatest sports, racing, and extreme sports games were being made around this time. Sure, the late 90s is kind of when it all started, but I'd say 2002 to like 2007 was really the heyday for these sorts of games. But in the midst of all of that, before Rockstar was known as the guys who only made Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption on alternating development timelines, they made a whole bunch of other stuff too. And you wouldn't know it by how much driving in GTA 5 sucks ass, but once upon a time they helmed a very good racing game called Midnight Club 3. A game so good, in fact, that to this day, the only series even approaching it in terms of quality is the Forza Horizon series. Now I'm going to smack down any Midnight Club purists here real quick because I do not like the rest of this series at all. Midnight Club's entire conceit was not just some racing game. It was like a head-to-head street racing beef character interaction game. A bunch of wacky and campy personalities designed to simply act as trash talk before you take them on in a race, earn their respect, and work your way up the hierarchy. Pretty much simple as that. Not my thing. At all. What makes the third game so special is that it mostly bucked all of that nonsense. It retained some of the names, a few personalities, although mostly in the mechanics, and I'm not talking like gameplay mechanics, I mean like the mechanic that works on your car. Then they took those bones, and on top of that, they built a thoroughly fun, insanely well-structured, and very satisfying to control open-sitting racing game, and made it 1,000 times better. Now, I can't stress enough that the best version of all of this is the Remix Edition, which adds a fourth city in Tokyo as sort of a side campaign to progress alongside the regular campaign. The conceit here is so much more about collecting cars and upgrading them than anything else. It's about building the best, the fastest, and occasionally sort of coolest in a very mid-2000s looking kind of way if you're into those sort of car designs, which, given my heart is still stuck in 2005, I definitely am, but Midnight Club 3 is the odd one out in the quadrilogy, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's much more of a pure racing experience, and in that way actually surpasses so many other racing series that were all trying to do the same thing at the same time. From Need for Speed to Burnout to Juiced, all of which had things going for them in their own way, and among all of those, I think Burnout Paradise is still the best, but Midnight Club 3 is leaps and bounds above even that. It is the greatest arcade-style racer in history. Everything that the old Cruisin' and San Francisco Rush games aspired to be someday. All of it culminated with this game, and then Los Angeles happened, and while I understand that people like it, I find it to be a serious step backwards, but also just not as fun. I like the multiple cities. I like the racing structure. I really like the controls in Midnight Club 3. It's actually pretty damn loose and very, very touchy, which in most racing games sounds like a bad thing, but given the tight spaces you have to maneuver around in, on top of the insane speeds this game runs at, the way you thread your way through traffic and slip into tight alleyways only to drift hard left at over 100 miles an hour and skid past cars and buses as you do so is a remarkably satisfying experience that I've yet to see any other racing game surpass. Like I said, at times, Forza Horizon has come very close, but even all these years later, I just come back to Midnight Club 3 and only Midnight Club 3. It's truly by itself in this regard, untouched and untainted. The only problem is that Rockstar has completely forgotten about it, much like so many other great games they've forsaken for their big two, and in my eyes, that's the worst crime this company has ever committed, in terms of IP, of course. Rockstar obviously has many other problems, but that's not something I'm going to discuss here. I'm just so annoyed that they think anything in Grand Theft Auto and that game's horrific driving mechanics can even come close to matching the beauty that was Midnight Club 3, and for shame to anyone that thinks they're even in the same atmosphere. This game is still one of a kind, and until anyone is able to even meet its standard, it's going to remain my uncontested racing king of the mountain. You know, having just come off of a Let's Play of this game's predecessor, I really thought that I was going to be swayed in some way. Just like I thought back when I Let's Played this game back in 2020, I keep telling myself that my gut feeling has to be wrong, that I've just got this unshakable bias because I played the sequel first as a kid, that there has to be a real reason I feel this way beyond the fact that I think it's just better. Upon further evaluation, nah. I don't think I'm ever changing my mind on this one. Guys, look, Banjo-Kazooie is a great game. It really is. But I still think its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, is one of the greatest games of all time, and no amount of repeat playthroughs will ever convince me otherwise. In fact, I'm starting to think Banjo-Tooie was actually very ahead of its time. You see, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, platformers were already becoming tired. Collectathons were especially so, and adventure games were favoring either the Legend of Zelda route or the Tomb Raider school of game design, much more than what Mario, Sonic, and Rare were doing. Mario was just kind of king of the mountain, left to his own devices, and in a way, you could say the same thing about Sonic, while Rareware had just released Donkey Kong 64, and opinion on their platformers dramatically shifted from king of the crop to, well, still very good, but maybe getting a bit too big for their own britches. It's funny, too, because around the end of the aughts, there was this sudden desire and clamoring for more. Bigger equaled better, and every game had to be open world, a philosophy that still kind of persists to this day. Back in 2000, Banjo-Tooie probably felt a little too bloated to many people, and I can totally understand why. The worlds went from 20 to 30-minute romps in Banjo-Kazooie to 2 to 3 hour-long canvassing sessions of these huge play spaces that open up gradually as more abilities are unlocked. You don't spawn into a world and see it for all that it is the moment you enter. You have to actively unlock more of it, seek things out, and truly discover what makes every given world tick. What's more, sometimes you have to go back into a world later after another ability is discovered or a path is unlocked, which was absolutely unthinkable in the first game, as you were actively discouraged from leaving a level or dying before you had discovered everything within. Isn't it funny now that after the open world renaissance, the oversaturation, then the rejection of open world games, and then after all of that, a second open world renaissance, that Banjo-Tooie looks positively quaint by comparison? Look, I know some people think the word backtracking is this insanely dirty term that should never exist in any video game ever, but I think those people are wrong. Just wrong. Video game world design is just as much about instilling comfort and familiarity in the play space as it is giving players an enjoyable environment to run around in. You like going back to Treasure Trove Cove, not just because it's well designed and fun to explore, but also because you know it like the back of your hand. Yeah, you only go through it once a given playthrough, but you wouldn't call playing it again sometime later backtracking, right? Obviously, that's not the exact same thing, and I can understand the criticism more if Banjo-Tooie forced players to spend anywhere near as much time in a space the second time around as they do the first, but the game only gets easier to travel around and only becomes more interconnected the more you play. The sense of progression in this game is insane, and you are only asked to do more to go back to places you've already been to and to figure out old puzzles anew as you are given more tools with which to do so. Every sequel in the history of Forever either gives you a new character or finds ways to strip away all your old abilities to make you earn them all again. I have never in my life played a game that so expertly retains all of the old abilities from its predecessor while adding nothing but new mechanics. Sure, they aren't all winners, and I can understand that some people don't like the split-up mechanic very much. I do. I like that this game is about a duo who still work together to get things done, whether together or apart. I like that it's all additive. Everything just builds upon itself, and each world is more technically impressive than the last. Possibly the only criticism I have mostly falls on World 6, in that it's a bit too esoteric and complicated, even more so than all the worlds that came after. But that one criticism aside, this game is so much more than just a platformer and a collectathon. Man, it's an adventure! A huge adventure that goes so above and beyond anything the Nintendo 64 had ever been capable of up to that point. It's also not Donkey Kong 64, which makes it more of this happy medium. Can I also say that I just love the way Banjo controls here too? Part of my problem with Banjo-Kazooie is that Banjo does not feel like a character that is meant to be controlled precisely. He's a little slippery, a little too heavy, a bit too chunky to easily maneuver in tight spaces and on small platforms. He controls well in open space, but is much more frustrating to operate on those skinny railings that you have to crawl across in some of the later levels than someone like a Mario or a Gex. This is why I think Banjo-Kazooie is great for the first several levels, but starts to fall apart a little in the later worlds like Rusty Bucket Bay and Click Clock Wood. In Banjo-Tooie, the entire game is pretty consistent when it comes to making the platforming more about ability usage and making proper jumps than it is about being wholly precise, which I think works more to the game's benefit. I also just appreciate how unique the world design is in Banjo-Tooie. When every other platformer out there has your standard desert level and beach level and lava level, Banjo-Tooie always offers twists on these conventions. Jolly Roger Lagoon isn't really a beach level, but more of a pirate town with a series of interconnected underwater environments. Hailfire Peaks is a lava level, but it's also an ice level. Pterodactyl Land isn't so much a jungle level as it is straight up dinosaurs and cavemen. Glitter Gulch Mine is, in and of itself, very different from anything else I've seen in a video game. It's a mine with that sort of late 1800s, early 1900s prospector-y vibe, but it's also very dingy and dark and muddy and not super upbeat or shiny like you'd expect it to be, not glimmering with gold and gems and whatnot. Witchy World is a theme park, but a very uncanny take on the idea. It's not so much run down as it is maliciously designed, yet there's still kids running around. Almost something you'd see from a Tim Schafer game rather than something from Rareware. It's also just rife with dark humor. I know Rareware has always been pretty good at that, but here in Banjo-Tooie it's taken to another level. Killing the Ice Cube couple, smacking a literal child so he'll listen and go home to his mom, dead alien babies, and a pig named Chris P. Bacon. Seriously top-notch stuff here, even if some of it might be a little shocking in an E-rated game. I always loved Rareware's ability to sort of be boundary pushing with that stuff before they got straight up explicit with it. All in all, it's still my favorite 3D platformer, guys, like, of all time. No matter how many times I play it, that notion is only reinforced. I love it so much, and I still think it was genius years before anyone was ready for it. And the last hurrah of a once great development studio combining all the knowledge from their previous good games into one great epic that I think is vastly underappreciated. Banjo-Tooie still fucking rocks. It's funny because I just spent the last entry taking time to kind of come after the open world obsessed video game industry of today, and then the next game right after it is in fact an open world game. Again, though, this is definitely more of a me thing. So I take it that a lot of people really don't vibe with the Horizon series. They find it very cookie cutter, very manufactured, very serious, and kind of boring? I mean, sure, I can understand all of that. It does take itself very seriously, and I did say earlier in this same video that I love camp. I do. But you know what my absolute favorite aspect of storytelling is? It's definitely not plot. It's not characterization, although that is definitely important to me most of the time. It isn't always theming or atmosphere or the emotions of the story itself, although again, I do appreciate these things when they are done well. For me, it's world building, far and away. I don't care how bad your storytelling actually is, if the world that it's set in and the lore and environmental storytelling aspect around everything else is brilliant, I'm in, baby. This is something that can be ascribed to a lot of games on this list, but I think none more perfectly so than the Horizon series. Currently 2 games that's looking on to become a trilogy someday. I absolutely love this game's setting in that it appears to be set in this weird, almost alternative future, but it's actually just a post-apocalyptic scenario, one that is unraveled through the events of the first game. This reason and this alone is why I have Horizon Zero Dawn here over its sequel, Horizon Forbidden West, a game that admittedly improves upon its predecessor in almost every other way. As a gameplay experience and as an action game and as an RPG, Horizon Forbidden West is the slightly better game, but as a complete experience, I still think Zero Dawn takes the gold. The plot itself isn't actually bad either. You just have to kind of make it through the first several chapters of the game to really experience that shift for yourself to see why. As a hero's tale, I wouldn't say it's anything special, as Aloy herself is a good character, but not some super different, diverse, and interesting one. I like her personality, but that personality is very obvious and very candid from pretty much minute 1. You can figure her out within the first 5 minutes of the game, but she's still a good character. She's abrasive, she's proud. I like that. The immediately apparent world, from tribes to cultures and civilizations that stretch beyond, seems kinda uninteresting until again, you see what the entire story is building up to and reveals this world as. When you see it as it is, it doesn't seem particularly enthralling. When you start to see for yourself how the entire game actually takes place in Colorado and Utah, and see how everything connects, that's where it gets really, really cool, and even a bit profound in a deeply ironic and even kinda sad sense. Horizon Zero Dawn truly surprised me and subverted so many of my expectations back in 2017, and I still hold it in high regard as a uniquely memorable experience because of that. But the entire reason I was interested in it to begin with, even before I actually played it, was because of the robot dinosaurs, obviously. Look, I really like the combat in these games. I find it to be a lot of fun, scratching a certain sort of itch that no other game does. It's like this happy middle ground between fighting animals in Far Cry and the epic battles of Monster Hunter. It's not as shallow and wacky as the former, without being as in-depth, complicated, and arduous as the latter. They're just cool interactions that never go on for more than 5 minutes at a time outside of the most extreme scenarios. But especially on harder difficulties, they can still be true challenges that absolutely take you by surprise and require you to be on your toes, remaining relentless and very engaged so as not to get overwhelmed too quickly, particularly in battles against the likes of Thunderjaws, Stormbirds, Rockbreakers, and Fireclaws. And then Forbidden West one-upped all of those with my absolute favorite machine of all in the Slaughter Spine. Zero Dawn still has plenty of great battles and encounters that make for intense challenges that can be approached in a dozen of different ways. I love the combat here. I really do. I think if the third game continues to iterate on this beyond even what Forbidden West did, this may become my favorite trilogy of all time as far as action gameplay is concerned. It's just so enjoyable. I recognize that the Horizon games aren't for everyone, especially for plot and character forward-minded players. They're just not going to vibe with this the same way that I do. I recognize that. This is a series that ticks so many of my boxes, though, and there really is nothing like it. Even the open world mechanics, the vaguely Ubisoft-esque design, they still find new ways to shake up the formula with it time and time again, to become more freeform, more open-ended, and more interesting, on top of some of the coolest backstory and world design this genre has ever received. I will always sing this series' praises, even when I know that it isn't everyone's cup of tea. Remember everything that I said in the lead up to Super Mario Sunshine like 7 entries ago? Okay, let's crank that idea up to 11. I don't think this game really needs any introduction of its own. You know it well, and I'm certainly not about to give any sort of history on this one beyond just the bare essentials. I've never really called myself a smasher. I don't like Super Smash Bros. That much to really go all in and play it obsessively. As a kid, I actually didn't click with Melee all that much, and it was actually Brawl that I would go on to spend the most time with due to the sheer amount of content packed in, as well as its single-player adventure mode. It wasn't until around just before the COVID lockdown, actually, that Melee finally got on my radar again. You may have heard of this documentary called The Smash Brothers, released by Samox back in 2013. It's still freely available on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it, I sincerely cannot recommend it enough. Best gaming documentary I've ever seen, and it's not particularly close. While I definitely missed the boat on this era, this is essentially my generation right here. My people, my childhood. These are the kinds of kids I grew up alongside, and I didn't fully understand why everyone in my generation liked Melee so much until I saw this documentary. Until this 8-part series helped me understand what makes this game so special, and, well, I already told you what it is about this area of video games that I love so much. Now that I know how Melee is actually supposed to be played, oh my god, you guys, I love this video game so much. Super Smash Bros. Melee is an institution, a game that has so far outgrown its initial design intent that I hardly even consider it in the same category as the other Super Smash Bros. Games. It's beyond the Nintendo sphere, untouchable in its outreach, and easily the most enjoyable fighting game to watch and play, although it's certainly not the only one I like. I love Melee so much, man. I love the movement and the shmovement. Learning to wave dash, L cancel, shield drop, ledge dash, parry, and chain grab have been such gratifying experiences. Playing this with friends or online is so damn satisfying and unlike any other fighting game, and just rewarding to get better at. Even though I'm not nearly as good as most people playing this game, my fingers turn into a pretzel and I can barely reliably hit my L cancels on any character not named Sheik, but I still feel absolutely exhilarated every time I fire this game up. What an experience it is to just break a fighting game like this in half and to experience even a fraction of the potential routinely achieved by the best in the world. The professional circuit is so fun to watch too. I've watched nearly every top 8 and every major for the past 5 years. I catch all the documentaries, follow the scene very closely, and engage with the community regularly. So much of what makes Melee great is more than just Melee, sure, but the game in and of itself is the essence behind what makes it all so special. There's a reason so many people still love it so dearly. There's a reason it has the reputation and legacy that it does. Why it's one of the only games as old as it is to have hundreds of thousands of passionate fans who enjoy it regularly in spite of the efforts of its developer. I'm just happy to count myself among them, even if I'm probably nowhere near as good at playing it as most of them. I grew up on a lot of first-person shooters. To this day, I still play a lot of first-person shooters. I'm very surprised myself to see that only now am I finally getting around to talking about a first-person shooter on this list. But hey, it's a damn good one. 2016 is what I consider to be the last truly amazing year in game releases. Some people would argue differently. 2017, 2019, hell, even 2023 had some seriously great games, from Baldur's Gate 3 to Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. It was a big year, yeah. But 2016 was absolutely loaded. The greatest year of game releases I can remember in recent memory. Overwatch, Uncharted 4, Dark Souls 3, Stardew Valley, Inside, Firewatch, The Last Guardian, Titanfall 2, and that super memorable month of Pokemon Go taking over the entire world. Man, what a time that was. It truly felt like every single month something special was going to happen. But smack dab in the middle of all of that released a game that everyone thought was going to absolutely crater due to a terrible beta, bad first impressions, and its publisher actively withholding review copies until the game launched. Nobody thought this thing was going to be good until it released. Doom 2016 was my game of the year that year, and to this day it remains the finest first-person shooter campaign in the history of the genre. I love this game so much. It perfectly captured not only the essence of Doom in the modern era, but what a first-person shooter at its very core should always aspire to be. Fun. Much like what I said about Uncharted 2, this game is just non-stop, but even more so in this case. The move or you die gameplay, the constant peaks and valleys of having ammo and then suddenly not having ammo, which leads to constant weapon swapping and the progression of said weapons as you go. The very fundamental basic mechanics that make Doom work with its movement and speed, its fast-paced enemies, and actual satisfying executions that are genuinely rewarding and not just fluff to make the game look cooler than it is. The fact that this game didn't throw ham-fisted RPG mechanics and low percentage meaningless staff buffs and skill trees beyond a very basic weapon upgrade system, yet still felt satisfying to progress through its perfectly paced 8 to 10 hour campaign is something even its sequel couldn't manage. Look, I know a lot of people like Doom Eternal more than the first one. I am not one of those people. While it is still good and much more of a challenging experience than 2016, it just couldn't help itself in railroading some very tired and generic AAA mechanics that really just didn't need to be there to begin with. Plus, I kind of hate that game's level design. 2016 is actually a perfect single-player experience through and through. I have no problems with it whatsoever. I even like the story and the lore. I love the Doom guy's various expressions without dialogue, his pissed-off mannerisms, and the way he interacts with a couple of various smartest man in the room characters that he meets along the way. I love that there's actually a lot of deep lore and great world building here, but it's all relegated to a place that doesn't get in the way of the essence of what makes Doom so great. My only problem with this game is that the multiplayer just didn't need to be there, but it's not as though taking it out would make the game better either. The core of what makes Doom great is all that you need. This is an essential first-person shooter experience, and I love it to death. My only note is that if you play the Switch version at 30 FPS, you're doing yourself an immense disservice. 10 out of 10, amazing game in every single way. So this is another game that was in my top 5 back when I made the original list, and since then, I finally managed to give proper time to fully complete its much-lauded sequel, The Thousand Year Door, a game that I love wholeheartedly and actually think is much better written than its predecessor. That does not, however, mean that I like the game more than the original, and there's a few reasons for that. Yes, for starters, Paper Mario 64 is one of my favorite RPGs ever. I love it to death. From its presentation, to its world building, to its very simple but fun battle mechanics. I like it so much that I play through it once a year, every single year without fail. I think part of the allure for me is that the portrayal of the Mushroom Kingdom in this game feels like the definitive version to me, you know? From Koopa Village to Dry Dry Desert to the jungle where the Yoshis live to Shiver City. If you were to tell me that this is the exact iteration of the world Mario's been traipsing through in all his other games, and everything else is just a different perspective on the same environments, I'd totally buy it. This feels like, to me, the world of Mario more than any other. I love everything about it. I love its sense of humor, I love its cast of quirky characters, but more than anything, I just love the art design. It's simple, it's not overdone, but it's so clear and transparent in what it's trying to be. It feels like another home away from home, something video games are rarely able to achieve, I think. It's the quintessential RPG experience to me, outside of another series that we'll get into here in a sec. But let's talk briefly about why I prefer it to The Thousand Year Door. It's the level design, plain and simple. Paper Mario 64's worlds all feel so fully fleshed out and well realized. They almost seem like they were built first, and then the puzzles and enemies were added in second, with central guiding themes and principles to those worlds that are uniquely their own. Chapter 2 is a massive maze of a desert with a town stitched onto the end, but only after you make it through the entire mountain pass. Chapter 4 is a toy train track that branches out into multiple directions from each of its 4 stations. Chapter 7 is 2 interconnected towns with a dangerous trail between them, all sitting at the base of a massive mountain that you have to climb up to get to the very top where a palace awaits. While Thousand Year Door has some real highlights, like Chapter 3's The Glitz Pit and Chapter 6's Train and its multiple mysteries that need to be solved, there are some real stinkers, like Chapter 4's Twilight Town being like 7 screens across and the chapter's length being entirely padded out by the fact that you have to go back and forth across it a half dozen times. Or Chapter 7's bait and switch location that also pads itself out by making you go back to every previous chapter once before you end up in one of the least interesting locations in the entire game. I said before, when talking about Banjo-Tooie, that backtracking is not an inherently bad thing, and it isn't when the backtracking is used creatively and baked into the level design. I do not think backtracking is good when its inclusion is at the expense of the scope and scale of the world. Chapter 4 especially is just so egregious. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of Chapter 3 in the first game, if that entire world was cut in half. You remove the Forbidden Forest and the mansion and just keep the dusty town and the palace ahead, and then rather than simply proceed onto the palace, you had to go back and forth 5 or 6 times to get everything done that you need to. It's just not as tightly designed, I think. The Thousand Year Door is also slightly less engaging from a combat perspective. Paper Mario 64 marinates in its own simplicity by giving you exactly the tools you need to do exactly as well as you need to. Sure, you can break the game's difficulty with the right setup, but it's pretty tightly designed as long as you aren't exploiting things. The Thousand Year Door is a much easier game in this regard because it throws way more at you in terms of extra abilities and mechanics while largely retaining the same structure, which means that it's also a lot more forgiving. Again, certain areas of the game test this a bit, like the Glitz Pit, making it more engaging with certain functions and modifiers and whatnot, but I find many stretches of this game to be a chore to get through due to how thoroughly easy and uninteresting it is at times. And I really only found myself truly challenged during the final boss, which is not a good time for the game's difficulty difficulty to finally rear its ugly head. Paper Mario 64 is just a bit more smooth and steady in terms of pacing, and I find it more satisfying to play through. Not to shit on the Thousand Year too much, of course, it's going to be in the honorable mentions later. I just wanted to take the time to give my personal take on why I preferred the first game to the second. Both of them absolutely clear the rest of the series anyway. You'll never be able to convince me that Nintendo shifting away from this series' roots as an RPG was a good thing. No matter how much they play into the quirky nature of the paper-esque art style and world building, there's no reason they can't do all of those things and keep these games RPGs. Some of the best parts of both games were the partners. So many of them are just the best side characters Nintendo's ever given us. Bombette, Bow, Watt, and the try-hard Lackluster from the first game. Goombella, Koops, Yoshi, and of course, Vivian from the sequel. They're just an awesome cast of memorable designs, and it's such a huge shame we've never gotten anything close to these guys since. I really miss this brand of Nintendo character design and creativity. They've gotten so safe and so stale, and their new purported design philosophy around unique Goombas and Bob-ombs and the like is genuinely one of the dumbest rationales I've ever heard about their own game design since that time they said they couldn't make Zelda a main game protagonist because what would Link do then? And no, Echoes of Wisdom wasn't enough, guys, but I'm obviously rambling at this point. Another set of games for me to gush about on this list that have been unceremoniously waylaid by either the chase for money or arbitrary design philosophies that I'll never understand. If Nintendo ever does the Paper Mario series right again, I will be the first there to congratulate them. But in the meantime, at the very least, we'll always have these two. And in my case, especially Paper Mario 64. Hello there. My name is not Todd Howard, but I too would like to interest you in a very special hidden indie gem by the name of Skyrim. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's actually pretty good. Okay, in all seriousness, there never has been nor will there ever be a game with less of a need for an introduction than Skyrim. I genuinely cannot fathom who might be watching this video who doesn't know about Skyrim. But you know, lost in all the sauce of the memes and the parodies and the discourse about what everyone thinks is the most overrated game ever made and yada 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 yada, Bethesda this, Elder Scrolls that, Morrowind's better, and whatever anyone has to say about this game, it wouldn't be so ubiquitous if it weren't so damn appealing, right? The thousands of hours that I have spent in this world are matched only by one other game on this list. I have spent so much time with Skyrim that I dare not quantify it all. I started all the way back on the PlayStation 3. The worst version of the game, played it until my save file wouldn't work anymore, and then I played it again, and again, and again, and then I moved on to the PlayStation 4, same thing. Then I moved to Xbox because that had better mod support, and then I played it some more. And finally, I got it on PC, and once again, I couldn't stop. I have gotten every achievement in this game a half dozen times over. I have played through it in its entirety, barring a few side quests and errands here and there, at least another half dozen times more, and this is just unmodded playthroughs. Modded, I've probably started it another 2 or 3 dozen times, sometimes playing for a few hours at best, other times going 50 to 100 hours in before I moved on to a different save file. I am right there with all the other Sky babies. I've played a ton of Skyrim, guys, and I still love it. I don't care what anyone says. But I have to take umbrage with one word oft used to describe Skyrim and clarify a bit of something here. To this day, I still hear people describe Skyrim's appeal as simply immersive. And this was especially true back when it released in 2011. It was like the word used to define what made Skyrim so special, and I don't really like the word immersive in this context, because it gives people who haven't played Skyrim the impression that they're really going to get sucked in and truly believe this world is real and that they're going to feel a part of something bigger than they. Like, Skyrim is some true CRPG in the same way as something like The Witcher 3 or Baldur's Gate 3 or Dragon Age Origins if we want to go back to the time of Skyrim, which was kind of where the bar was at before Skyrim released. And it's not that. It never has been that unless you're completely deluded. You can certainly mod the experience to make it more believable and more immersive, but that's not what Skyrim is. That's why I hate it when I see people make those comparisons, because that's like comparing Mafia to Grand Theft Auto. Sure, on a surface level and from an outward perspective, those comparisons make sense. They're open city games about criminals driving cars around, right? Anyone who's actually played both series can tell you how stupid that is. By the same token, the first game I would say is kind of like Skyrim is actually The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. They're more sandbox games than they are CRPGs, more action-focused than systems-focused, with quests and dialogue, sure, but more focused on exploration than either of those things. If you call Breath of the Wild immersive, then Skyrim is similarly so. It's clearly game-y. In Breath of the Wild, you pop a fox with an arrow and it poofs into meat. In Skyrim, you stab a bear and he's carrying his own pelt in his backpack. It's surface-level immersion at best. The part that I think tricks people isn't the actual story or the NPCs or the dialogue or any of that stuff. It's actually the one thing that Bethesda really knew how to do right from 2002 all the way through 2015, and that nobody else has really ever gotten right before. And it's this. Just being there, in the game. The music in the background as you just walk. Yeah, sure, it gets interrupted every couple of minutes by a roaming pack of wolves or some bandits, but this feeling of just walking, swords drawn, looking up at Secunda and Master as Wind Gaiju plays in the background. This is the thing I appreciate the most about Skyrim. It's just wide open space that you can just sit in and appreciate. It has stuff to do, and that stuff is always there, but in between the lines is this ephemeral beauty, and that stuff sticks with you, man. It's so consistent in delivering this too, no matter what you're doing. You turn on Skyrim, and within the first hour, you will experience something like this, because it's what the game is all about. The give and take between doing and not doing. That's what I love about Skyrim, and that's what I think makes it so special to this very day. It doesn't need to be the best RPG to do this effectively. It's just simply unmatched in this regard. You knew it was coming at some point. I knew it was coming at some point. Everyone knew it was coming. Here it is. The guy with the Pokemon in the channel name had to have Pokemon on here at some point. Look, if I didn't establish that rule about one game per series at the beginning, there would have been like 3 on this list. Pokemon Emerald is my special little game in this exhaustive series. It wasn't my first Pokemon game, and I don't even think, when I take a step back and look at the series as a whole, that it's the best one either. But it's my special little game, and I'll defend it to the ends of the earth. Pokemon is just something I grew up alongside and has always been very important to me. It's a series I have a great attachment to almost exclusively because of the little monster designs. I just love them, man. They're so great. It's simple as that. I'm not as enraptured by Pokemon as so many other hardcore fans. I stopped watching the anime 18 years ago. I haven't competitively battled in over a decade. I don't really play the mobile games outside of that new TCG Pocket game, but even then I just kind of like collecting the cards. And speaking of card collecting, I maybe buy a couple of boxes a year at best, but I do have some. It's just kind of this consistent, tangential thing in my life that has shaped my love of gaming, but is also ubiquitous enough that it seeps into a whole bunch of other aspects too. I'm not so blinded so as not to see the issues and the flaws. I fucking hated Scarlet and Violet, man. Those games just not my thing at all. But I'm still looking forward to the next one. And the next one. While I got my start with the originals, Red, Blue, and Yellow, Gen 3 was kind of the generation that solidified my engagement with the series. When I was a kid, Pokemon was popular until it became cringe, and so I kind of just avoided it for a little bit until I found myself a copy of Pokemon Sapphire and secretly started to just get back into it. I put so many hours into that game, I broke the playtime counter, and would go on to do the exact same thing with Emerald. Hoenn is the region I've spent the most time in, and Emerald is, to this day, the definitive way to experience it. The 3DS remakes could have been. They really could have, but man, they fell just short, and I'll always think of those games as missed potential. Emerald is just special to me. That Mauville City music and the battle theme are burned into my brain for all of eternity. I could conjure them up in my mind in an instant, and like an annoying jingle, they'd never leave. They're just so a part of me now, and I'll never shake them. What really do I need to say to rationalize this? I love Pokemon, man. I really do. I'm just not the personality type to make it my entire personality. Again, barring the name of this channel, of course, I think you get what I mean. I'll mention a couple of others from this series in the honorable mentions in the next video, but I think you get the point. Pokemon Emerald is my baby, and I'll always cherish it. So back during the COVID lockdown, Sony gave out a bunch of free games on PlayStation as a part of this stay-at-home initiative. While I was still absolutely commuting to work through all of that, as I live in a state with no respect for the rule of sanity or the rule of law, I still made sure to pick them all up because, hey, free video games. One of these games seemed pretty familiar, but didn't annoying streamers play this game and just scream at it? Isn't this another Slender the 8 Pages or Five Nights at Freddy's? I just didn't want any part of it. So it sat in my library for a few months until one day, kind of on a whim, I fired it up. I always avoided survival games like the plague. I hate meter management games unless we're talking about tycoon games, and even then, I'm pretty particular. I always avoided optional survival difficulties in games like Fallout and Skyrim for this exact reason. Like, I really need food and water systems to waste my time and stop my progress over and over again when I'm just trying to get actual meaningful stuff done. It's not stressful, it's just annoying. I already have a hard enough time reminding my actual real self to eat, thank you very much, ADHD, but I digress. No, I didn't want any part of that with this game. But much to my surprise, it actually had a difficulty option that turned those things off, and all that mattered was health and oxygen levels. I could live with that. I have never in my life been so utterly captivated by and impressed by a game from the instant it began as I was with Subnautica. Being thrown into this utterly alien and hostile environment, forced to immerse yourself in the ocean, a place we all know humans don't belong, and you're only tethered to sanity and civilization being a giant powder keg of a ship burning off in the distance, only adding to the oppressive nature of it all. Man, I was hooked. I did the smart thing and played this with headphones on from the get-go, and what floored me right away was the sound design. It's actually not all that impressively mixed, but man is it effective at keeping you on edge. The world of Subnautica is inherently terrifying, yet it is the most colorful and least horror-coded survival game I have ever seen. It's bright and it's blue and it's literally swimming with goofy and cute little creatures who offer an abundant food source. There are so many things to help you get by, and figuring out how to subsist and survive in this game is genuinely, pathetically easy. I made the smart choice of eventually switching my save over to the difficulty that did require you manage food and water because I was starting to become unengaged early on otherwise. It's actually a core integral part of the game's pacing and progression, and it feels relatively empty without it. A far cry from most other survival games. But see, simply staying alive is a piece of cake. Building a base, having sources of food and water, living, that is not the core conceit of Subnautica. It's only the beginning. Eventually, the deep calls to you, and you have to answer that call. And this, truly, is where I fell in love with this game. I cannot think of another game that is more satisfying to progress through. Just the simple act of unlocking and building things, of gaining tools that make your life easier, or gathering upgrades and building vehicles and a place to live. Every single thing you do feels like an accomplishment in this game, because it is. And it never tugs on that rope. It never tells you to do something. It just kind of gives you nudges. It's like, hey, this is a thing you can go do, but you gotta figure out how to do it and where it is, because we're not really gonna tell you outside of a couple special instances. And that's the most this game gives. I can't think of one modern game that does a better job of this. And the little tug of war of mind over matter. Subnautica, outside of the hardest difficulty, is actually a very easy game to not die in. It's all about the mental aspect, to push yourself into the unknown, to rationalize with yourself why it's worth upgrading so you can go further. There are physical barriers to entry, yes, but the qualifications necessary to make it past those pale in comparison to the simple act of pressing W on the keyboard or pushing forward on the control stick when you hear a roar in the distance, when you look down and you see nothing but pitch black. I have never experienced anything like this game, and I doubt, outside of maybe a sequel, that I ever will again. Even then, the sheer concept of this game is something to be studied and understood better by other game developers. The psychological mind games of a patently bright, colorful, and super campy survival game that is so explicitly not a horror game, finding ways to scare you more than most actual horror games, is just something that is genuinely amazing. And on top of all of that, this is just another cool universe that barely shows its hand enough to open the door for so much more in the future. I really hope Unknown Worlds is able to continue with this series successfully, and that they and everyone else can continue to understand what it is about Subnautica that makes it so great. Especially since that, well, still a good game, Subnautica Below Zero kinda missed the mark in that regard. Five years ago, had I made this same top 20 list, this very spot at number 4 would have been occupied by Ori and the Blind Forest. I loved that game so very much, even as someone who's not personally super into Metroidvanias and traditionally difficult platformers. Something about the presentation and level design, the very Ghibli-esque fantasy world, and the way the visuals married with the audio to create one of the coolest worlds I've ever jumped around in a video game. I think the thing that stuck out to me the most, though, was just the way controlling the protagonist Ori felt. Their movements were so smooth, and the simple act of jumping was less like leaping and more like knifing through an air made of butter. So effortless to control and so unbelievably precise that I never felt like a death was anything but my fault, no matter how tight the timing was. It was also my very first experience with one of those more difficult platformers that kind of lets you die 100 times, but also lets you sort of save on the fly to counteract that. Not quite as hard as something like Hollow Knight or La Mulana, but certainly more difficult than Bloodstained Ritual of the Night or Shantae. My only gripe I had with this game was its story. Its initial presentation was fantastic, and anyone who's played it can tell you that this game has one of the best intros by a 2D game ever. But the finale undermined certain things that the story had built up as more impactful, and I think it rubbed people the wrong way. I personally didn't hate it too much, but I could absolutely see where people were coming from. Then 5 years later, we got the sequel, Will of the Wisps, and I think this game was a dramatic step up in every single conceivable way. So much so that I have a hard time not putting it into my top 3, but man, that top 3 is going to be impossible to crack at this point. We'll get to it in a bit. Will of the Wisps improved the combat by a lot, added so much to the movement, made the traversal even better, added additional challenges and an even better progression system, many more great characters, and so much more heart to the world and the story that just, I love this game so much. I love every location, every mechanic, every challenge. I don't love all the weapons, but mainly because the big fuck-off hammer is just so much more fun to use that I can't see myself using anything but. Will of the Wisps is pure, unadulterated 2D platforming bliss. I have never played a side-scroller in my life that feels better to play, nor looks better than this. I also think the story beats are largely better this time, unless you were looking for more from the same characters as the first game. There's even darker themes here, some really harsh lessons, and a finale that honestly might break you if you're not prepared for it. It actually subverts expectations in a way I don't think most games are willing to, and I respect it for that. It runs the gamut of emotions while still only improving on everything that made Blind Forest good. I think the only thing I may slightly prefer in the original to the sequel is the soundtrack, but only by a slim margin. Ori and the Blind Forest soundtrack is my absolute favorite soundtrack of all time, without question, but Will of the Wisps is probably still in my top 5. They're both brilliantly composed, and I personally believe that Gareth Coker is the best composer working in the video game industry because of these two games alone. My biggest black mark against Ori and the Will of the Wisps really comes down to its initial release, which was sadly not in a very good state, and against the leadership of the development studio itself. The game is fantastic, truly, but I cannot in good conscience support anything Moon Studios makes again, as long as that leadership structure remains intact. It's kind of why I'm talking about this game a bit less passionately than some of the others and a bit more matter-of-factly. I do love it. I really do. I mean that so much, but there's this lingering aura behind it that just, I don't know, man. It's a bit disheartening to know that such a labor of love was made so laboriously and so greedily. It's a truly beautiful game that I will love until the day I die, but the people behind that beauty really deserve better. Before I jump into the top 3, I'm just going to play off some clips of all the other games in what's basically my top 50. This will include games that couldn't make the top 20 to the stated rule at the beginning, such as the Thousand Year Door and any other Pokemon games I didn't mention. You get the picture. After this, we'll proceed right on to the top 3.
Wind, 3 knots, heading 274. Range, 95 meters. Projectile mass, 89 kilograms. Trust me.
Oh man, where do I even begin with this one? And for that matter, where do I even stop? I mean, holy crap, you guys. There is no video game that even comes remotely close to the amount of time and effort spent on as this one. And yes, I'm cheating here because I'm combining both games this time around. While yes, Destiny 2 is a functionally different product from Destiny 1, the entire experience has been seamless and continuous for me personally. One and the same. And yes, there are some differences and nuances to be discussed, but it's impossible to talk about one without the other. So I was there there at the very beginning, back during the beta in summer of 2014. Everyone was talking about Destiny like it was going to be the greatest thing ever. This studio, Bungie, had such immensely high expectations coming off of the Halo trilogy and ODST and Reach, and now they were being given even more money and less oversight, without the overreach of Microsoft, public enemy number one in 2014, just a year off of the worst console reveal and launch since the Sega Saturn. Bungie was about to knock it out of the park, and, well, the rest is history. But I stuck around, unlike so many others. We all know the kind of game Destiny turned out to be, right? I think a pretty pervasive theme throughout this list thus far has been hooks. Hooks are very important to me, and it's not just a video game thing. Even in music, sometimes what elevates a song for me above so many others in the same genre is a single moment in that song. The way the beat hits, a certain guitar solo, a tick on the vocals, or a specific breakdown. In gaming, it's the same thing. Many Metroidvanias are great and do many of the same things right, but the Ori series has found a way to make the simple act of traversal so enthralling, and I hold it higher in that regard. Doom, the movement. Horizon, the world building. Uncharted 2, the tone. Subnautica, the sound design. And Super Smash Bros. Melee, the mechanics. Destiny is going to be the last game on this list that makes it on here for the same reasons. I've played a lot of first-person shooters, and I can pretty definitively say that none even compare to the feel of firing a gun in Destiny, and that's the honest-to-God truth. That's the entire crux of the argument. No matter how many things Destiny's done right or wrong, no matter how many stupid design decisions or convoluted structure changes, no matter how many dumb or lame story beats the game hits, or how many times it picks itself up after hitting what we thought was rock bottom, only to dig even deeper a couple of years later. For more than 10 consecutive years, Destiny has been the best feeling shooter I have ever played, and nothing has ever come close. The stickiness of the guns, the feel of the pop from your hand cannon or the jittering of your pulsar auto rifle, the way the enemies' heads pop with it, and the particle effects that come with, all of it is basically just visual design. And it's purely perfect. In fact, the visuals are kind of what makes Destiny click for, I think, everyone. None of this game has good graphics argument, but rather the overall appeal of everything from the animation department to the art team and their world design and the way they make backgrounds look. Now, this is where I personally think Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 are the most distinct, as I do think to this day that Destiny 1 is the better looking game. It's not technologically better, it doesn't have better textures or higher resolution graphics or any of that nonsense, but it's more interesting. The softer lighting on more muted environments that still allows the colors to pop but not bleed. The way everything alien sticks out of the environment but doesn't overtake it. How enemies can sort of blend into the background but still have very identifiable characteristics and little aspects that still make their heads big, chunky bullseyes that every bullet will find a way to reach. Destiny 2, while still an excellent game and visually beautiful in so many ways, kind of strayed away from this design philosophy a little. It did launch at a time where more colorful games were becoming more pronounced and popular. It released just a year after games like Overwatch, Paladins, and Battleborn, and even more closely to the likes of Cuphead and Breath of the Wild. A certain visual flair seemed to appeal to the market more at the time, and I think Bungie chased that a bit, which sort of ushered in a change in Destiny's tone from post-apocalyptic sci fantasy to more of a high fantasy space opera. And I think that change was a bit of a downgrade, but it's still a good game in its own right. Many of the key locations, even in Destiny 2, are genuinely incredible to look at, from the Dreaming City to Savathun's Throne World to the very heart of the Traveler. Probably the only time the art team didn't strike absolute gold was during Lightfall, but even that was really only during the initial launch. Much of the post-launch content was every bit as excellent as their usual standard, and I think the absolute feast for the eyes that Destiny has always been is key to its success. It's what I love about it so much, and not just looking at it from a static point of view, but in motion, as I'm playing it. There are obviously so many other awesome nuances as well. The sound design is stellar, the many soundtracks have been fantastic too, and I'm not about to say that this game is bereft of great mechanics. It isn't. In fact, it's mostly been nothing but greatness. The things you hear about Destiny come down to the nature of what Destiny is, and that's an MMO. And it is an MMO, no matter how much the game industry and Bungie themselves want to pretend that it isn't. The only thing that separates it from your average MMO is that only 24 players can occupy a given social space at max. That is literally the only defining characteristic that separates it from social features from things like World of Warcraft or RuneScape. It's a massive game, it is multiplayer, it has raids, it has all of the same mechanics you expect from your typical MMO. It is just scaled down the number of players allowed in a given space to make room for the drastic upgrades to visual clarity, animations, and any anything else that can happen in the open world space, which is to say, Destiny's MMO nature means that players were and always will be asking more of it, and it has been forced to constantly deliver. It didn't nail absolutely everything, but what game like this has, especially after 10 years? It spent the entirety of Destiny 1 improving apart from maybe one setback. It made the absolute worst call with the sequel and trying to appeal to a wider audience rather than to the players that were still on board after 3 years. Then it flipped back so hard in the other direction and catered to that core fan base that it actually alienated the rest of the gaming public for like 5 years straight and left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. I'm sorry guys, but y'all kinda had to be there to understand. Sure, there were bumps in the road along the way, Lightfall and the concept of sunsetting content being the two most obvious and well known, but even those were really nothing in the grand scheme of things. I'm not excusing them, to be sure, just that when stepping back and looking at Destiny as this entire 5,000 plus hour experience I have spent so much time on and made so many friends as a result of, that those things just barely sour my overall feelings on the game. It's funny too, because at the time of writing, I'm really kind of over it. I've spent more time in the past 6 months playing the first game, a game that hasn't been updated in almost 8 years, than I have with the sequel, which is halfway through its epilogue chapter right now. I just can't be bothered to care with where Destiny is, but none of that changes the excellent time I've had with it. With all of the memories that I've made, the raiding and the PvP and the strikes and the exotic missions, even the busy work meant to help me de-stress after a long day at work. I've put hundreds of dollars into this game, but it's giving me back that same time and value over 100-fold. It's been a thoroughly messy, frustrating, and even heartbreaking experience at times, and yet I'm so glad I went through it all. I'll likely never be done until Bungie is done. I'll take my breaks, sure, I'll fall away, move on to other things, but when they work their magic, when they make the guns shoot better than all the other video game guns shoot again, and the shooting is fun, I'll be right back there all over again. I really don't even know what to say here that I haven't already said hundreds of times regarding Shadow of the Colossus, and while it pains me to keep this short and sweet, I think I'll do just that. Some games are just a part of you, you know? The games that stick with you is so much more than just something fun to play. I've waxed lyrical on how much I love this game's boss design, how I love its themes, the hundreds of ways it can be interpreted, and even the way its dedicated community has been parsing it and pulling it apart for over 15 years. I even made a video about how I find Shadow of the Colossus analogous to my struggles with mental health, and I know I'm not even the first nor the last person to do that. Hell, there's an entire movie that talks about it in Adam Sandler's Reign Over Me. Great film, by the way. I do recommend it. Shadow of the Colossus is intrinsically intertwined with who I am as a person, plain and simple. At times, it's the loneliest, most solitary game that you'll ever play. One man riding his horse in a forgotten place, wasting away with the passage of time. And at others, it's actually quite loud, crashing into the earth as the colossi roar and the music swells. It's a dichotomy that I value from a deeply emotionally personal place. Sometimes I just want peace. I want silence. I want the world to go away for everything that it is. I think we all want that to a degree. Sometimes. Just a little bit. But sometimes, when I'm ready, I just want to be tested, to feel pushed against. Something to exercise my passions against. While all I'm doing is felling the monster, Wander is giving every part of his soul to save the one he loves. It's symbolism, yeah, but it's also just pure catharsis. Shadow of the Colossus, for all of its simplicity and its open-endedness, is what it is because of the impressions it allows you to leave upon its oft-trodden footpaths. Everyone has their own idea of what it is. A lot of people really don't see this game as anything special. It is, after all, just a boss rush game, in the purest sense. It's why I think I was so offended back in 2015 when a friend of mine recommended this indie game called Titan Souls to me, thinking I would enjoy it because I like Shadow of the Colossus. In my mind, I was like, how dare you boil Shadow of the Colossus down to something so shallow and uninspired as this? That's all you think it is? Just boss fights? It's not just the battles themselves, but the spaces in between and the world all around you that makes this game what it is. But also, how dare I assume that someone else could see it the same way as I do? How pretentious is that? I definitely didn't come to that conclusion until many years later. I like to think that's part of maturing, of growing up, but I don't know. A lot of me has changed in the last 10 years, even if it isn't immediately apparent. But I'd like to save that for another video, I think. The essence of this list, I think, lies in the answer to that question. What does Shadow of the Colossus mean exactly? To anyone else, I can't pretend to know the answer. That's extremely presumptuous of me, and I would be nothing less than an asshole to pretend otherwise. But to me, the answer is very simple. It means everything. So why then, do you ask, is it not my number one? Why then am I proceeding on to another entry as if it were nothing? A game that, while yes, I have poured my heart and soul into once before on this channel, I don't talk about nearly as often as Shadow of the Colossus. I think the answer to that lies in how anyone values video games, and what we get out of them. Shadow of the Colossus is something I would classify as an experience, sure. It's so many parts, but the simplicity of it is what defines it, and that allows me to connect with it in the way that I do, but probably the least of any of that comes down to its interactivity, to actually playing it. And interactivity is extremely important to me when properly defining video games. It is, after all, the entire differentiating factor between this medium of art and any other, using player input to exact that art. Play, man! We associate that word with children far too much. Every human deserves the right to not only play, but to be allowed to play, to love what they play. You can call whatever hobby you would like what you want. The old man scrubbing barnacles off his boat after spending the day out fishing on the lake, call it what you like. To him, that's play. It's our earth-given right to have those things that keep our brains happy. It's part of the human condition. And man, when I want to play, when I want to take a video game that tickles my brain in a way no other does, I think I'm always going to come back to my number one, my tried and true, my Okami. My Kamiya-esque take on the Legend of Zelda formula, with hack and slash combat, with detailed and descriptive dialogue, with its crazy fun brush mechanics, and a beautiful take on Japan. Its Sumie art style, its breathtaking design, and unparalleled soundtrack. A soundtrack so good, it was like a six-way team effort by so many of the greatest game composers Capcom has ever employed. Okami is as much a game as it is a saga. People often describe Okami as almost hilariously long and played out, and God, that's so much of what I love about it. From Shinshu Field to Agata Forest to Taka Pass to Ryoshima Coast to Kamui, these are like my homes away from home. The fields I played in growing up and that I still play in now. I love every single aspect of it all. And, well, I was going to actually move on from here, but I wrote the first half of this passage about 2 months ago, and in that time, well, I don't know if you've heard the news, but Okami is getting a sequel, which in my mind was absolutely unthinkable when I had begun writing all of this. I was going to spend the rest of this entry explaining why Okami clicks for me and its spin-off game Okamiden does not, but I don't think that that's a very good use of my time here anymore. Instead, I'll just leave a few more anecdotes with you. I've talked extensively about the nature of video games as pieces of art. In every frame and in every pixel on screen, there is a devotion, passion, and dedication to make Okami what it is. Its utter uniqueness, its daring to be different. The things that caused Capcom not to believe in it way back when, but has resonated with millions more in the years since its utter commercial failure. There is a passionate following of this game all these years later because I think when it comes right down to it, millions of people want more games like this. It isn't the majority, mind, but Okami represents a latent desire burning within a lot of fans of games who feel underrepresented, who want these experiences as places just to be in, as worlds to immerse ourselves in. Look at any one of the clips on screen and tell me where else you can find any of it. There's just an unmatched creativity here, and while I'm so incredibly excited for Clovers' second effort with Okami, I can only wish them the best of luck. More than anything, the fact it's even happening is something everyone should celebrate. This is more of what video games need to be. Experiences. Things that people didn't know they wanted before they had it. Publishers shoot down and cancel game ideas like this all the time, and when they do let them slip through, they sabotage them to make their heavy hitters and more popular franchises look better. We should all be clamoring for more Okami. To me, it represents everything I want video games to be. Everything I want from this hobby, with no cons in between. It's the only game I consider absolutely, personally, perfect, and I will cherish it for as long as I live.